Sure. Well, welcome everyone. It is a true privilege to be able to moderate this panel. It's a topic, not just one that I'm interested in, but I have the privilege of introducing people whose knowledge on the topic is, well, it's at the edge of what we know about spectrum and spectrum rights. Spectrum's a hard topic. I mean, it's complex. It sort of requires a degree in engineering, a degree in law, and a degree in politics to really come to grips with. And so to open the conversation, I want to quote a woman, a British economist, Joan Robinson, and she said, "The purpose of studying economics is not to acquire a set of ready-made answers to economic questions, but to learn how to avoid being deceived by economists," which I think is a good kind of scene setting for spectrum policy, because there is a great deal of money involved in spectrum and a lot of vested interests. And it's a complex topic, so it's easy to be intimidated by assertions about what spectrum is and what it isn't. And so I think I would like to invite you on this journey of discovering, what spectrum is, what access to spectrum means, and what spectrum rights are. And it just needs more people in this space. And with that, I'll turn to our panel. And yesterday, I introduced Antony as the OG, the original gangster of Indigenous spectrum rights. I met Antony 12 years ago in Italy, and he had been campaigning already for 13 years for Indigenous spectrum rights for the Maoris. So it is truly a privilege to have you here. And Darrah Blackwater. Darrah is the CEO of Blackwater Consulting and has been a fearless champion of Indigenous spectrum rights in south of the border, and has galvanized people to her cause bit by bit. And last but not least, Professor Gregory Taylor. Gregory is the associate professor at the University of Calgary, and has, one of the few academics in Canada actually paying attention to spectrum policy, and also a tireless advocate for Indigenous spectrum rights. And I think maybe we'll turn to you first, Greg, and to give your opening remarks.
Okay, I just want to ensure that I'm on right now as far as my make sure that this is working properly. I'm just checking here as far as my share screen button. Let's see. There it is. And let's see if this works properly. Okay. Steve, I can see you. Can you just give me a thumbs up if this seems to be working?
We see your file directory, but we don't see the presentation.
You don't? Well, that's a problem. Just a second. I'm going to share screen.
That's better.
Is that working, Steve?
Over to you.
Okay, good. All right. Well, thank you, Steve. Darrah, good to see you. And Antony, I really wish that I was there, that I could meet with you. I'm currently in Calgary, and getting to the East Coast when I have a 1-year-old at home did prove to be a bit of a challenge. So thank you very much for having me speak today on this incredibly important issue. And very much what Steve said to start, it's a complicated issue. For those who are coming into this relatively new, if you find yourself a little confused by it, that means you're likely paying attention. There are a lot of different factors at play. And I think, though, a good one to start with when we're talking about this is the fact that when we're talking about the radio spectrum, the frequencies that we use, they are public property. And this is really where all of this argument begins. We are talking about a public resource. Now, People will also say that, oh, this is very high-tech discussion, that a lot of this is all new. No, it's not. And on the Atlantic coast, you would have a long history of this, because this is the same thing Marconi used to send the first radio signal across the Atlantic more than 100 years ago, about 120 years ago. So we're not talking about really new technology. We're just using it differently now when we talk about the use of mobile broadband. So it's the same type of technology. We're just using it differently. So this is something we've been doing for a long time. It is public property, and this is where the idea of Indigenous rights really comes to the front and center. Now, when we put this panel together, I was asked to, the topic was going to be the future of spectrum, Indigenous spectrum sovereignty. And I guess my short answer to that key point is it's very precarious right now. We have a small window that's opened. And I think that what I'm going to try to get at today in my topic is how important it is that we seize this moment that's here right now. First off, I want to start with the fact that this idea was nowhere in Canada until very recently. And perhaps some of the people that I'm going to be singling out here who've done some work in the last couple of years, I can't see the room. If I'm mentioning you, please stand up and take a bow, because these are people who have brought this issue to the forefront. So there was an article written in the Globe and Mail. Note, this is all 2022. This is a major story written in the Wire report by Gina Kokolo, and this came out again in 2022. It was a fantastic study on digital sovereignty and for Indigenous spectrum issues. And then this was from a journal called Policy Options that a lot of policy makers read. And this was written by James Hobart and Cindy Woodhouse. Cindy, I believe, is now the head of the Assembly of First Nations, about spectrum issues and Indigenous communities. So you have people who've been doing work in this field. All of this, though, was in 2022. So we're not talking about a long history in Canada where this has really been brought to the forefront. And at the federal level, where this really matters, one of the last issues, or one of the last policy consultations brought up by ISCD, which is the federal department that studies that deals with spectrum policy, in 2021, they made no mention at all on Indigenous sovereignty or Indigenous issues in this consultation in 2021. So my point being that this has really only been an issue for Canadians, even though this has been around forever. It's been at the political level. It's only been the last 2 years. By 2022, the consultation on non-competitive, and again, for those who don't work in this field, I'm sorry, the language is boring. There's no way of getting around it. When the ISCD put out this consultation, they did now, by 2022, include this consultation on on rural indigenous deployment. We had to address Indigenous issues, but not until 2022. But please note, Indigenous communities brought this to the forefront. So they received comments on behalf of Spuzum First Nation and 61 signatory nations across Canada, calling for access to Indigenous communities and unused spectrum over their land. This is the first time that this really happens in Canada, and it was only 2 years ago. At a larger level, so the way the ISCD works is you've got these pieces where they put out little chunks of spectrum. By the way, if you're wondering what are these spectrum frequencies, if you've got a local radio station, it's probably 107.1 or something like that, or 99.3. Same thing, the spectrum frequencies that we're using. And these are the ones that are used for your different bands for your cellular phone. And so the ISCD auctions off blocks of spectrum at a time. But In this, which is their spectrum outlook, this is where they plan ahead. And in 2018, they released their spectrum outlook, and never once in that document did they discuss Indigenous issues. It wasn't until, once again, when they had to review it again in 2022, and some of this was brought to the fore by Indigenous communities, others who submitted to ISAD saying you've been ignoring this issue. I was among that group. In the newest spectrum outlook, Indigenous connectivity is now its own policy theme in the document. So please note, ignored in 2018, by 2022, it's a central theme for the whole document, and the word Indigenous appears over 50 times. And so ignored in 2018, now it's a bigger issue. But even though that there's reason for optimism here, I temper this by saying that there is a resistance, and this is a global issue. The idea of Indigenous spectrum access is not a Canadian issue. As we're about to hear, it's been a much longer fought battle in New Zealand. There is a resistance happening in New Zealand. It's also been an issue in Mexico. It's been an issue in the United States. So we knew that at some point there would likely be a backlash at some point, and I think we're seeing it right now, in particular in New Zealand, and we'll hear more about this. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail because I think we're going to hear from someone who knows much more than me about this area in just a minute. So I'm kind of skipping through, but the reason I'm bringing this up is to show, if you're looking here in 2023, there's been pieces written now where they're starting to challenge the idea of Indigenous spectrum rights. So again, this is New Zealand, so I'm going to skip through it. Okay, so what about here in Canada? Well, it certainly looks as though we're heading for a change of government here in Canada. And this is something that could have some real impact on this issue of Indigenous spectrum rights. And I'm not here to say about, vote this party or vote another party, but I do think that it's important to take a look at a bit of the track record this way. So when we look at, for example, Canada's adoption of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, Liberal government made this part of Canadian law in 2021. The opposition across the country all came from Conservative premiers, Doug Ford, Jason Kenney, Scott Moe, Brian Pallister, and Blaine Higgs. All of them opposed this for various reasons. And at the federal level, the Stephen Harper administration, when they also were dealing with this same document in 2010, they called it an aspirational document. They were not going to bring it in as part of the law of the land. And they were one of only 4 governments in the world to vote against this. And so the Conservative track record is suspect in some of these areas. And the initial Conservative operation concerned the Declaration's policy concerning land and natural resources. And this is why this is so important for the discussion of spectrum, is that for a lot of people, we're talking about issues of natural resource. So I think that it's the reason that I bring this up. If we do have a change of government within the next year or so, what we're facing right now is a very short window of opportunity. So the Government of Canada currently has the Indigenous priority window, which an idea they've largely borrowed from the United States and through efforts of people like Darrah. And so we have this. It's happening right now in Canada. The first round of comments has already gone through. The reply comments is open now. I believe we're going to be hearing more about this in detail at this conference as well. So all this to say is that we've got a narrow window. There is one other point, though, that I want to make before I finish up here. There's another document, and it's called the Spectrum Policy Framework for Canada. This is an important one because we go through these changes of government. The policy can generally change along the way, but this policy framework tends to last. The last time that this was changed was in 2007. So we've had this in place now for getting close to 20 years, more than 15 years. And it's due to be updated. The current spectrum policy framework says nothing about Indigenous access. If they update it, and if Indigenous rights are put into this document, this becomes much harder for any government to then fully change direction on this. And this is why I think this matters so much, and why I hope there's some discussion around this in the room over the next couple of days. If Indigenous access rights can be put into the spectrum policy framework when it is revised, and it should be any year now, and there are people probably in the room who know more than me on this, it's an opening to further entrench Indigenous access to national spectrum policy issues. That I think that this is something that could remain in force for decades. So I think that this is something that needs to be discussed, that Ottawa needs to recognize that this can't be a passing thing of just the last 2 years, that this has to be more of a long term. So the movement, I think the moment's now for Indigenous spectrum rights in Canada. There is opposition to this, to Indigenous spectrum rights. Both Bell and Rogers are opposed. And the very fact that the two largest companies are opposed to this is a problem long-term in Canada. There's international precedent, the case of the Maori people in New Zealand. We need to be watching that, and I'm so glad we have someone who's such an expert, the OG, as Steve said, to discuss this. A Conservative government coming up in the next 2 years might change the direction, so we have to be ready for that. And I think that a spectrum policy framework may offer a way to transcend shifts in government. So, and I think I misspelled that. So anyway, that's all that I have for today. And I just think that there's a lot to think about right now. And I look forward to hearing from the others on the panel about some of these key issues. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Greg. That was an amazing summary of 4 years of intense work. And I think, well, let's turn south of the border and hear, how things have evolved in the last few years for you, Darrah.
Is this on? Okay, cool. Okay, good morning, everyone. So I got into spectrum policy when I was in Washington, D.C. And I just want to do a quick room check to make sure everyone knows what we're talking about. So, Greg did a great recap of the policy of it, but I kind of want to just walk it back for a second and just talk about, really the essence of what this discussion is about and why it's so important. And so I imagine most of you probably know what we're talking about in the depths of the policies, but really going back a step and saying, spectrum, my legal foundation for the work that I'm doing is that spectrum is a natural resource. And so we're essentially looking at the radio waves that we're utilizing for telecommunications that are just naturally occurring on this land. Nobody's making them, nobody's creating them. We're just using something that's already here, that's in our natural world. So that's what we're talking about, the radio waves, the frequencies. It's electromagnetism that's just naturally occurring in our world, which is kind of a crazy thing, and we've learned how to send data over that, and that's really amazing. So this started, when did Marconi send those? Was it the 1800s, early 1800s? So we started learning how to send signals over the electromagnetic spectrum in the 1800s, but spectrum existed before that. And a lot of what I talk about, a lot of what I'm interested in right now is exploring what did that look like to Indigenous peoples before we started sending data over the radio signals. I don't believe that we never had a relationship with this relative, with this natural being that's in our world, before the first signals were ever sent in the way that we know that they can be sent today. So in my mind, I look back at Indigenous art. I look back at, spectrum is rainbows, spectrum is sunlight, spectrum is ceremony. Spectrum is the way that energy transfers through what we perceive as nothingness. This is what we're talking about with these frequencies, and these frequencies can be used for different things. When you look at the map of how Canada uses frequencies, or how New Zealand or the US uses frequencies, some of it's cellular, some of it's for radio astronomy to look out into space and see what's going on out there. Some of it is for ships to talk to each other. Some of it is for science. A lot of it's for military, especially around the borders. That's a huge issue down on like the Tohono O'odham Nation. Communication through waves is something that Indigenous people have understood through watching our relatives like bats and whales. These are not new concepts to us, and spectrum is something that we see in lightning and thunderstorms. It's something that we can experience through sound and through the way that we feel. So Indigenous peoples have had relationships with spectrum long before we started using it for telecommunications. It's just so pertinent right now that we're using it for telecommunications because of the economics of it. And it is so, so expensive. I don't know what the numbers are in Canada, but I know that since the United States started selling spectrum in 1993, they started auctioning it off. They've made $258 billion off of it. And tribes whose land spectrum has been sold off of have never seen a dime from that. And so what we're talking about is essentially the extraction of a natural resource through a license. It's a bit different than physically taking something, but it is extractive in the way that the federal governments are selling it off of tribal lands. It's a natural resource. That money's not going back to the tribe, nor is, I say tribe because that's how I refer to our peoples, but you understand what I'm saying. Native nations, First Nations, Métis, Inuit here, none of that money is going back to the Indigenous peoples, and they're also not able to benefit from the natural resource that's being taken from them. Hopefully that kind of sums up what we're talking about, but that's the big picture. I think Antony wanted to respond to something in Greg's presentation as well, so I'll throw it to you.
Is this working? 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Kia ora tātou, tēnei te mihi kia koutou, kua tau mai tēnei rā, ko Antony o tōku ingoa. Tēnei te mihi kia koutou, te tangata o Memahau, o tēnei wahi, nō re tēnei te mihi. I'm Antony Royal. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things. First of all, Darrah's conversation about the use of spectrum, and it is entirely true. Our elders have stories of how spectrum was used well before we were colonized by the English, and about how our mountains would speak to each other. And it was through electromagnetic radiation and the way in which lightning and many of these other physical forces connected many of our mountains and our rivers together. So there's a long history and a long conversation that has occurred that we can point to as having a relationship to spectrum. Of course, spectrum today is used for a wide range of things, from radio, television, to telecommunications, communications with satellites, a whole range of things. So that was point one. Point two was, Greg, I just wanted to come back to your presentation. I saw there a quote from a paper that talked about some resistance to the work that we had been doing in the Memorandum of Understanding we'd signed with the government. Actually, I saw that paper when I was, after I'd been invited here, I was flicking through all of the previous minutes and papers that had been discussed at previous of these summits, and I'd come across this one that started talking about us, and I thought, that's really interesting. Some international crowd has got a hold of what we're doing and has done some summary of what we're doing. And then as I looked further into it, I went, oh, where does this come from? Which university is this? It's clearly an academic paper. Only to discover that the author of this paper was an academic from our own university, Victoria University in Wellington, our capital city. And this was completely unknown to me. And I thought, how could these academics write such a paper and not even pick up the phone and have a talk to us about it? I mean, it's unbelievable. So I just want to assure you that that paper, Greg, has absolutely no visibility whatsoever in New Zealand. That is, it's an outlier and a surprise to me. Not particularly well researched, and certainly didn't have, what's the word? What's the nice word? They should have just picked the phone up and had a discussion, and perhaps got some comment from us about the arrangements that we've put in place with the government. So anyway, I just wanted to assure you that paper that was in your resources is not the prevailing view of wider New Zealand on what we're doing. Anyway, so just wanted to inject a bit of tension into the panel conversation. Thanks.
Perhaps they already knew the answers they wanted before. So coming back to your point, Darrah, about spectrum being a natural resource and naturally occurring, I think just to build on kind of an awareness of what's at stake, it's why do we manage spectrum? Why don't we just let everybody use whatever radios they want? Well, the answer is really, really simple. It's to control interference, to manage interference. So if two of you are chatting at a table, that's fine. You can have a conversation. But if everybody is shouting at the same time in the same place, then it's very hard to understand what's going on. So the purpose of spectrum management is to actually find ways for people to be able to talk to each other in a way that doesn't interfere with other people. And the dominant way that's come about is that the agencies responsible for spectrum have assigned property rights to it, right? Or property-like rights, so that when you get a spectrum license, you are deemed to own it, for a period of years, and that gives you a degree of exclusivity. Now that's an arbitrary way of talking about something that is, as complex as spectrum, but it is one that's led to the regime that we're in now. And I guess a question for you, Antony, is how has that affected your advocacy, and how have you been able to exploit that property rights-based regime to support your work?
Well, I have to admit something first. New Zealand was the first country in the world to actually adopt this management rights regime. And it was back in 1989 when the legislation was passed in New Zealand around taking a natural resource, creating a property right around it, a tradable property right, and then the government would then go and on-sell that either by auction or by some other means. But it was a tradable property right, so somebody could buy it and then go on and sell it to somebody else, presumably for a higher price. It was all based upon this theorem that Roland Coase put forward back in the early 60s. And the theorem basically was that the most efficient way of using a scarce resource was to be able to give it to the person who's prepared to pay the most for it, which probably didn't take into account that self-interest played a big part in how people actually use these property rights. Nonetheless, back in the late 80s, New Zealand was going through a process. We called it Rogernomics. It was a privatisation process. We had the new Labour government came in. We were coming out of a very ultra-conservative government. The new Labour government came in and privatised everything. They sold off the railways, they sold off the post office, they sold off all the assets, and then they saw these spectrum rights and said, oh, we can sell those off as well. So apologies that we were the first in the world to do it, and it wasn't long after that that the US and other jurisdictions followed suit. Now, if you were, there's another conversation to be had, is saying, well, if we looked at that now, would we do the same thing again? And you'd probably have a really good, hard think about it. But the fact that those property rights were created and what triggered the Māori response to the government at that time, particularly around telecommunications spectrum, was that the government was assuming that these property rights were theirs to go and on-sell. And that was the point at which Māori said, well, hang on, no, these natural resources, you should not assume that you own them, that you can go off and auction them. And so that was the basis of the claim that was taken in 1999. And we are well ensconced into this management rights regime, even though it may not be a perfect way of managing spectrum. Nonetheless, we have negotiated, and I'll talk about this afternoon, we have negotiated a position whereby we are able to benefit from these rights. So we've negotiated an arrangement with the government that 20% of all of these property rights will be allocated to Māori free of charge. So I'll talk through that this afternoon, but it's, you know, we do walk a little bit of a tightrope on this one. On the one hand, we might say at some point, don't know whether this is the right way to manage spectrum in the future. But on the other hand, it's useful for us because it does generate commercial income for us.
Thank you. Darrah, where do things stand in the US now in terms of the advocacy for Indigenous rights and access to spectrum?
So in 2020, we had our own Indigenous priority window, sort of. It's called the Rural Tribal Priority Window that was opened in the US, which I have a ton of beef with because the fact that it was a rural designation, there's 574 federally recognized tribes in the US, and there's more that are unrecognized or state recognized. We've never seen an urban-rural distinction in tribal policy before, so the FCC, our CRTC, sort of just like made that up out of nowhere and said like, well, if you're an urban tribe, you're not eligible to get this spectrum, but if you're a rural tribe, you are. Again, back to the economics and the price disparity, you know, spectrum is more valuable in more urban areas because it's the calculation of its value is factors in population. So wherever more people live, the spectrum is more valuable because telecoms can make more money off of it. So the urban tribes were excluded from it, which was a huge problem. But all of that said, they got 2.5 gigahertz spectrum, which is, you know, people call it beachfront spectrum. It's a really good band of spectrum. So a lot of those tribes are now just sort of like figuring out how to keep it because there's certain build-out requirements that are attached to it where you have to cover a certain amount of people in your area by a certain point, and those deadlines are coming up. So there's sort of, I think Canada's IPW, the Indigenous priority window, is largely modeled after our tribal priority window, and so we're a few years ahead as far as, you know, who's going to keep it, how burdensome are those requirements? You know, are people meeting them? How expensive is it to meet them? Is it realistic? Those sorts of things are going to be shown soon in the next few years. So that's a lot of what's happening in the US right now. And as far as getting more spectrum, you know, it's something that I'm always pushing for. I don't exactly know what that looks like for the US. You know, we tend to be a pretty litigious country, but this might not be the best Supreme Court to see this issue. They tend to not love Native people down there. I don't know if you've heard, but yeah, it's going to be a really interesting thing. I guess the timeline is like, by the time I retire, I would like to see substantial movement on this issue. You know, I don't think that it's going to be like the next 5 years or the next 10 years that like amazing things are going to happen. But I think, you know, hopefully, I'm 33 next week, so hopefully by the time I'm 53, we can see something happen.
It is a long journey. It's a really important one, but the policy of spectrum policy change is a slow one. Greg, I don't know if you want to come in on the issue of the priority window, which has been proposed by ISED, largely modeled on the US. Do you have any thoughts on what has been proposed so far by ISED? Or feel free to take the conversation in another direction.
As Darrah said, it's largely borrowed on the US model. I think what's important to note right now is that the time frame for initial comments closed, I believe, end of April, and we're in the reply period now. If you have never participated in a government consultation this way, it's pretty dry. There's no getting around it, but it's really important. And I think that wherever you're from, you should get your voice heard here. And for those of us who do participate in these hearings, the government has an obligation to read and offer some degree of response to everything that is sent in on these. Now, what generally happens is that when they put out these consultations, most Canadians ignore it. Indigenous or not. We don't even know they're happening. And so it becomes a discussion between business and government. But it's about a public resource. So I think that the fact that this priority window exists right now is extremely important, and one where I think that the Indigenous communities really need to be organized and offer some sort of input on this. And I know if you haven't got a background in this, it's hard to jump into this and make sense of it. So I think, working together with different groups from across the country, I think it's really important to get your voice in now to make sure that this doesn't close, because I'm very concerned about the future of this policy. So I think that it's important to try to get involved now. The government has opened a window, and I know they're calling it a window. And I think we need to take advantage of it. As I said in my presentation, this didn't exist 2 years ago. So I think the important thing is to note, now's the time to act and to make sure voices are heard.
Thanks, Greg. I think, oh, sorry, please go ahead.
I was going to make a couple of suggestions. These consultation processes are very dry. We've been dealing with them for decades. And in the 2000s, the government would go out to consultation on a various range of spectrum topics. And what would happen was that the government would decide what they wanted to do, they'd write a paper, they'd put it out and then say, well, can you please respond to this paper, tell us what you think, and then what you would do is then write it in. They would then summarize it, and then they would present it to the minister and say, well, this is what they said and this is what we should do going ahead. It wasn't a particularly satisfactory process. Nonetheless, I think it's important to participate in the process. So every consultation paper that I wrote started with a statement at the very beginning of the response to the consultation process. And that statement said, this consultation does not substitute for appropriate conversations between the government and Māori people as partners. That's the first statement. This consultation process is for every man his dog. It is not for a conversation between the government and Māori as an Indigenous people. That's point number one. And then point number two is setting a long-term vision. Oh, here we go. Setting a long-term vision. Even if this consultation that they're asking for around this particular topic was, just a minor point or just one part of it, I think you have to state your long-term view, your long-term vision for access to spectrum, and state that right up front. Right. In order to work towards this long-term vision, here's my views on this consultation process. Anyway, that's what we did.
That's great. And I think you were saying earlier that now, in terms of spectrum management globally, the International Telecommunications Union is the treaty body that where discussions are had around spectrum allocations and spectrum use. National delegation that represents them at these treaty meetings. And I think you were saying that the Maori are now part of the national delegation for New Zealand. Is that correct?
We have carved out an agreement with the government that we will be part of the New Zealand delegation. Now, we haven't actioned that just at the moment because these conversations that get had internationally are very dry, are very long, are very resource intensive, and we've got better things to do at the moment. But at some point, we are going to participate in that because spectrum is, each country has its own sovereignty around how spectrum might be allocated. But the reality is, if you want devices and if you want to be able to take your iPhone from Canada to the US and work, I presume does it work? I presume it works if you go across the border. You have to have some degree of spectrum harmonisation across all of the jurisdictions around the world. And it's even more important now that we've got a whole bunch of satellites whizzing over the top of us and a lot more to come, is how we are allocating spectrum to terrestrial and to satellite. And all of these discussions get held at an international level, and that's where you want to be long term. If you want to really affect long-term spectrum policy decisions, you have to be at the international table.
Thank you. I think we're coming to the end of our session, but I'd like to invite closing remarks from our speakers.
Yeah, is this working? Yes. Okay. I just want to piggyback off of that and say I think that we also need to be thinking even further and wider about spectrum and what it could mean for the generations in the future. So I've been working with, I was just in Washington, D.C. at a National Science Foundation Spectrum X conference, and a lot of it is about spectrum sharing, but there's a lot of radio astronomers that were there to kind of like to present about some of the things that they've been doing and sort of get their bid in for the spectrum that they need to continue their work and their study. And as we as humans are pushing out further into space and talking about colonizing Mars and figuring out how to build things on the moon, which is happening now, and they're planning radio astronomy sites on the moon, where the dark side of the moon, where there's no interference from Earth and you can see further out. And our president of the Navajo Nation, Boo Nygren, just sent a letter to the White House a few months ago asking them to stop a mission to send human remains to the moon that a private company had set up. And they didn't stop it, but the mission failed. And this is something that our fellow colleague and I, Graham Everton, had talked about a lot, that space is something that we really need to think about protecting, and spectrum has a huge part of that, because you can't travel to space and you can't communicate to space and you can't look further out into space unless you have spectrum as well. So I just kind of want to broaden the conversation in our minds as we're leaving this conversation, because right now we're talking about being able to communicate from here to America or here on Earth, but the implications of spectrum rights for our children and grandchildren and beyond is much bigger than that, which is kind of a wild thing to think about, but that's where we are at this moment in history, which is really exciting and really terrifying in lots of different ways.
Thank you, Darrah. I think everyone's heard of Starlink in the room, and as a rural connectivity solution, spectrum is heavily involved in the ability of satellites to be able to communicate with the Earth, and is yet another frontier in terms of spectrum use. Greg, may I turn to you?
Yeah, I guess just as a closing point, I got into the study of spectrum kind of through a back door. I was studying over-the-air television in Canada, something perhaps some people in the room will remember. That a lot of us used to get our TV just through an antenna. By the way, I still use an antenna, but only in the cities. Rural areas lost it. And if you wonder why that was taken away in a lot of rural areas, it was because the government wanted to take that spectrum that over-the-air TV was used for and sell it to wireless service providers because it was worth a lot to them. My point of this being that I quickly realized that this thing I was writing about television wasn't about television at all. It was about spectrum. And the real power right now lies in spectrum access. This is an incredibly significant area of contemporary communication. I suspect everybody in the room right now is using a wireless device somehow. My computer I'm speaking into right now has no wire running into it. It is using spectrum to send this signal right now. And so I think that for a lot of us, we're using this regularly. There's an incredible amount of power involved and economic and political power in spectrum rights. So I think again, it's an incredibly important moment, and I hope organizations like this get involved because we need as many voices as we can in this important debate.
Here. Thanks, Greg. Final word to you, Antony.
I'll just make a quick comment because I've got some further final closing comments later this afternoon. It would be great if we got to create an Indigenous chapter. Personally, I don't like the word Indigenous, but a chapter that inside the ITU that can deal with spectrum policy matters as it relates to Indigenous peoples. I think that would be really good if we could do something along those lines. And the second comment was around spectrum. So the utility of spectrum, we're facing in New Zealand some conversations that are coming up around 600 megahertz spectrum. We've got millimeter wave spectrum coming up. We've got 2300 and 2600 megahertz. We've got 3.4 gigahertz. There's a whole range of policy decisions coming up and they'll be facing us within the next few years. Now, some people argue, well, why do you need spectrum? Because, aren't we all getting fibre? We will need spectrum for a long time to come yet. We can't get fibre everywhere. Fibre is fantastic for backhauling, but at the end of the day, if you've got mobile devices where you can't actually have a physical wire running to them, spectrum will still be really, really important. And this work that we need to do on spectrum policy has got a long, long life left.
Thank you. I think just one final word is to say that it seems to me that the opportunity to learn from each other is huge. I mean, we've heard about New Zealand and the US and Canada today, but in Mexico, I wish my colleague Eric Huerta were here to talk about how they've managed to get a spectrum set aside for Indigenous communities in Mexico. In Chile, these conversations are happening as well. I think, moving forward, there's an opportunity to share knowledge as these things evolve. And I just want to say thank you so much. Such a privilege to be able to moderate this panel with such knowledgeable speakers. Thank you.
I just wanted to add, if anyone wants further resources, I had Antony on my podcast. It's called Determination, Determined-Nation, and we talked about everything about this, and Antony had wonderful things to say about it. So if you want more, that's where you can find it, at Determination. Thanks.